Welcome to Books and More, the channel where we explore timeless works that have shaped the human story. Today, we journey into the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, a monumental masterpiece of historical writing. With its sweeping narrative, sharp intellect, and profound reflections on power, virtue, and decay, Gibbon's work remains one of the greatest achievements in literature. Join us as we uncover the rise, the glory, and the eventual collapse of one of the world's most extraordinary civilizations. Chapter 49: Conquest of Italy by the Franks. The long contest for the mastery of Italy, a land coveted for its beauty, its antiquity, and its symbolic weight, enters a decisive stage in the history of Europe with the arrival of the Franks. This chapter traces the slow unraveling of Byzantine authority in the peninsula, the growing audacity of the Lombards, and the transformation of the Roman bishop from a spiritual leader into a temporal prince, roles shaped not by ambition alone, but by the urgent necessities of a collapsing world. Ultimately, the chapter reveals how Charlemagne's conquest of Italy set into motion political and religious forces that would define the institutions of medieval Christendom. At the heart of the conflict lies a seemingly remote theological controversy: the struggle over images. The emperors in Constantinople, alarmed by what they saw as the creeping idolatry of Christian worship, condemned the veneration of images and attempted to enforce their decrees throughout the empire. Yet Italy, and particularly Rome, clung fiercely to the traditions of the Church. To the Roman clergy and people, the icons were not idols, but memorials of the saints, aids to devotion, and emblems of their spiritual identity. The edicts of iconoclasm were met not with obedience, but with resentment, and the gulf between Rome and Constantinople widened. While the gulf widened spiritually, the political situation grew perilous. The Byzantine Empire, beset by enemies on every front, could no longer defend its distant Italian territories. Its exarch in Ravenna, once the guardian of imperial interests, lacked the means to repel Lombard aggression. The Lombards, firmly established in northern Italy, pressed steadily southward, testing Roman defenses and threatening the independence of the papacy. In this climate of abandonment and danger, the Romans began to lean increasingly on the Pope, not merely as their spiritual shepherd, but as their earthly protector. Thus, the papal authority took on a new form. What had begun as a moral leadership now expanded into civil administration and political governance. The Pope became, in effect, the ruler of the Roman people. Yet, despite the devotion of his flock, he held no army large enough to resist Lombard pressure. Appeals to Constantinople were met with indifference. And so, compelled by necessity rather than ambition, the papacy looked northward beyond the Alps, toward a rising power whose kings had already demonstrated both their piety and their martial vigor: the Franks. The Frankish monarchy, under the Carolingian mayors and then their kings, had grown into the most formidable power in Western Europe. Its warriors were disciplined, its rulers devout, and their clergy deeply tied to Rome. When Pope Stephen crossed the Alps to anoint Pepin the Short and urge him to defend the church, he found a willing partner. Pepin marched into Italy, checked the Lombards, and bestowed upon the papacy the lands that would form the nucleus of the papal states. But Pepin's intervention did not bring lasting peace. The Lombards bided their time and, upon his death, renewed their pressure on Rome. At this critical moment, Charlemagne inherited both the Frankish throne and the obligations forged by his father's alliance with the papacy. When Pope Adrian appealed for aid, Charlemagne responded with characteristic decisiveness. He gathered his forces and crossed the Alps, not as a cautious diplomat, but as a monarch determined to settle the Lombard question once and for all. The campaign was swift and overwhelming. The Lombard fortresses fell. Their king, Desiderius, retreated to Pavia, and after a prolonged siege that tested both endurance and resolve, the city surrendered. The iron crown of the Lombards was placed upon Charlemagne's head, making him master of Italy. Charlemagne's conduct after the conquest reveals the breadth of his political vision. He did not plunder Italy as a conqueror, but administered it as a restorer of order. He respected the rights of the church, confirmed the papal territories, and reorganized the administration of the Lombard kingdom according to Frankish principles. His rule brought stability where there had been uncertainty, and justice where there had been oppression. Under his authority, Italy was not annexed as a subjugated land, but absorbed into the growing structure of a Christian empire. This union between the Frankish king and the papacy reached its climax in Charlemagne's imperial coronation. On Christmas Day in the year 800, as he knelt in prayer at St. Peter's, the Pope placed upon his head the crown of the Roman emperors. Whether Charlemagne anticipated or desired this honor remains a matter of debate, but its consequences were profound. A new Western empire was proclaimed, reviving the ancient name of Rome, but transforming it into a medieval institution rooted in Germanic traditions, Christian ideals, and papal authority. Yet this revived empire was not the empire of Augustus. Its center of gravity had shifted. Its institutions reflected the feudal and ecclesiastical character of the age. Italy remained a valuable and dignified appendage, but the real power lay beyond the Alps, among the Frankish nobles whose consent was essential to the imperial title. Nevertheless, the coronation symbolized the decisive transfer of political leadership in Europe from Byzantium to the West. The Eastern emperors protested, but their power over Italy had long been a mere illusion. Charlemagne's rule made the separation final. After Charlemagne's death, his empire fragmented, and Italy once again became a prize contested by ambitious nobles and distant monarchs. Yet the transformation initiated by the Franks endured. The papacy, having secured a protector and a territory, continued to act as a sovereign power. The German kings, inheritors of the imperial title, repeatedly descended into Italy, seeking the legitimacy conferred by Rome. The political order of medieval Europe, its empires, its kingdoms, its perennial struggles between church and state, bore the unmistakable imprint of Charlemagne's conquest. Thus, the fall of the Lombard kingdom and the rise of Frankish Italy were more than events of military importance. They signaled the birth of a new political world. The ancient Roman Empire, long diminished, gave way to a Christian empire whose authority rested not on the memory of conquest, but on the alliance between a Western monarch and the spiritual head of Latin Christendom. This was the moment when medieval Europe began to take its enduring shape, when the papacy and the Frankish crown forged a partnership that would influence the course of the West for centuries. Chapter 50. Description of Arabia and its inhabitants. In turning his view toward Arabia, the historian must contemplate a land whose physical features, manners, and ancient institutions shaped the destiny of nations far beyond its barren frontiers. Arabia stands as a peninsula girded by deserts and seas, a natural fortress that kept its people isolated from the great empires surrounding them. This stern environment produced a race of men who prized freedom more than dominion, whose customs resisted both tyranny from within and conquest from without. For centuries they wandered the sands as tribes rather than subjects, bound by ancestral honor rather than written law, and fortified by a rugged independence unrivaled in the ancient world. The land itself divides into three great regions: the stony highlands, the central desert, and the fertile south. The highlands and deserts sustain the nomadic Bedouin, who roam with their flocks across distances that would daunt the settled nations of the Mediterranean. The south, by contrast, contains the remnants of ancient wealth, the legendary Arabia Felix, whose spices, perfumes, and trade once attracted the envy of kings. But even in these more prosperous districts, the authority of monarchs remained precarious. The Arabian tribes would recognize a chief when it suited them, follow an emir when war demanded it, and disperse without hesitation whenever his authority seemed burdensome. Their loyalty rested not on force but on persuasion, and the desert, always open behind them, guaranteed their liberty. The Bedouins, fierce and hospitable, embodied the virtues and vices of a people shaped by scarcity. They were capable of generosity that astonished the stranger and of feuds that endured for generations. Their courage was sharpened by want, and their pride fostered by the knowledge that no foreign conqueror had ever mastered their sands. The Arabs themselves traced this independence back to the remote antiquity of Ishmael, whose descendants had supposedly been blessed with the hand against every man. Yet this independence was not absolute. The kingdoms of Yemen and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina occasionally fell under the influence of foreign powers, Abyssinians, Persians, or later the Turks. But these intrusions seldom lasted, for the desert tribes would never accept long-term subjugation. Commerce formed the one enduring bridge between Arabia and the outside world. The famed caravans of Mecca traversed the peninsula, bearing incense, gold, and the treasures of distant India and Africa. Through these yearly journeys, the merchants of Mecca acquired not only wealth but a cosmopolitan understanding rare in the ancient Near East. Their caravans bound together the scattered tribes, and the city that guarded the Kaaba became a sacred center whose prestige exceeded its modest size. The pilgrims who came to venerate the black stone provided a constant stream of wealth and gave the Quraysh, the noble tribe of Mecca, a dignity that rivaled the courts of civilized nations. Religion, too, cast its varied influence across Arabia. Long before the rise of Islam, the peninsula had become a refuge for diverse faiths. Jews fleeing Roman persecution, Christians escaping sectarian disputes, Magians from Persia, and the ancient Sabians all found in Arabia a land where belief was tolerated so long as it did not challenge tribal autonomy. Paganism remained predominant, expressed in a pantheon of local deities whose shrines dotted the landscape. Yet beneath this variety lay a spiritual restlessness, a sense that the old forms were waning. The Arabs acknowledged a supreme god above their idols, and many tribes had already abandoned the most barbarous rites, such as human sacrifice, by the time of Muhammad. The habits of everyday life in Arabia were shaped by the starkness of the environment. Water was a sacred treasure, wealth measured in camels, poetry the noblest art, preserved in the memory rather than ink. The nomad scorned the comforts of settled life, believing that genuine virtue could thrive only in the hardships of the desert. This disdain for luxury was both a strength and a weakness. It sustained their independence, yet limited their political development. The Arabs practiced circumcision, avoided swine's flesh, washed after intimate acts, and guarded traditions so ancient that their origins were already forgotten. These customs were not the creations of Muhammad. They belonged to the deep foundation of Arabian life and explained why aspects of Islam would later resonate so strongly with the people. The tribe, not the individual, formed the bedrock of the Arabian social order. Blood relations determined loyalty, justice, and war. An insult to one member could ignite a feud between whole clans, carried on for generations with unyielding ferocity. Yet in their councils, the tribes could choose leaders by merit or age, granting authority rooted in respect rather than coercion. A chief who abused his power would soon find his tents deserted and his followers seeking a more generous guide. The desert allowed no tyranny because it offered an escape from it. Women, though subject to the limitations common in ancient societies, were not entirely without influence. A queen such as Zenobia could rally warriors. A spirited woman of noble birth could direct a tribe. Still, inheritance followed patriarchal lines, and the customs of marriage varied widely between tribes, some noble and others cruel. The intellectual life of the Arabs flourished in poetry. Their verses preserved their history, celebrated bravery, and condemned treachery. The annual fairs of poetry, where bards contested for honor, acted as both courts of memory and instruments of unity among the diverse clans. The spoken word, carried by travelers along caravan routes, preserved culture with a vitality unmatched by the manuscripts of more settled nations. Amid this tapestry of freedom, hospitality, superstition, and martial vigor, one perceives the early conditions that allowed a prophet to arise. Arabia was not a land steeped in darkness, but one in which ancient traditions mingled with new religious currents. A people accustomed to tribal arbitration were ready to hear a message of moral reform. A society weary of petty feuds could be stirred by a vision of unity. When Muhammad appeared, his appeal lay partly in the continuity of his message with existing customs, and partly in his ability to transform that heritage into a new force capable of shaping the world beyond Arabia. Thus, the chapter portrays Arabia before Islam not as a formless wilderness, but as a coherent, ancient, and morally complex. Its deserts preserved freedom, its trade fostered connection, its tolerance allowed diverse beliefs, and its unique balance of simplicity and pride made it the unlikely yet fitting cradle of a movement that would overturn empires and alter the course of human history. Chapter 51: Conquests by the Arabs. In tracing the astonishing rise of the Arab nation after the death of Muhammad, the historian confronts a movement whose speed and scale defy the ordinary measures of human ambition. Issuing from the deserts of Arabia, a land hitherto dismissed as barren and politically insignificant, the Arabs emerged in the 7th century as a conquering people whose religious fervor and martial vigor overwhelmed the most ancient empires of the world. The chapter unfolds this vast transformation, showing how a people once confined to their tribal rivalries carried their banner across Persia, Syria, Egypt, Africa, and finally Spain, carving out a dominion greater than that of Alexander and more rapid than that of the Romans. The unification achieved by Muhammad did not perish with him. Instead, it served as the foundation of an expanding political organism. Abu Bakr, the first caliph, restored the unity shaken by apostasy and, having consolidated Arabia under Islam, directed the energies of the faithful outward. His circular letter, calling the tribes to the conquest of Syria, appealed to the religious ardor of a people newly awakened to the belief that fighting in the cause of God was the highest of merits. The desert warriors answered the call with an enthusiasm that astonished even their leaders. They complained not of hardships, but of inactivity. The scarcity of provisions or the heat of summer seemed trivial compared to the glory of serving the faith. The first campaigns in Syria revealed both the courage of the Arabs and the weakness of the Byzantine provincers. Though the cities were numerous and the countryside fertile, the population had been exhausted by decades of Persian wars and internal religious conflicts. The Arab commanders, above all Khalid, the sword of God, combined audacity with strategic prudence. They defeated imperial armies in open battle, conducted sieges with patience and ingenuity, and exploited divisions among the local populations. The famous cities of Damascus, Emesa, and Aleppo, long accustomed to the luxury and learning of Hellenistic civilization, fell before the fierce simplicity of the desert soldiers. Even Antioch, the ancient rival of Alexandria and Constantinople, could not preserve itself from the advancing tide. The fall of Jerusalem carried immense symbolic weight. The holy city, contested by empires and sanctified by prophets, surrendered after a siege marked not by cruelty but by solemn negotiation. The Caliph Omar himself traveled from Medina to receive its submission. His entry into Jerusalem, unadorned, modest, yet majestic, struck contemporaries as the triumph of a new moral order. The conqueror refused the pomp of Roman emperors and the ceremonial excesses of Byzantine governors. He walked through the city as a servant of God, refusing to pray in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, lest Muslims someday claim it and dispossess the Christians. This mixture of rigor and tolerance became a hallmark of early Islamic rule. Yet the conquest of Syria was only the beginning. Persia, long the rival of Rome, now lay vulnerable. Weakened by internal strife and by the decadence of its kings, the Sasanian Empire crumbled before the disciplined enthusiasm of the Arabs. The decisive victory at Qadisiyah shattered Persian resistance. Ctesiphon, the royal capital, fell soon after. Its white palace, once the marvel of the East, was plundered with a fervor heightened by the belief that the prophet himself had foretold the event. The once mighty empire dissolved as cities surrendered, fortresses were abandoned, and the monarchy fled toward the distant mountains of Media. Persia, whose culture had influenced the ancient world for 1,000 years, was subdued within a single generation. From Persia, the tide of conquest rolled westward into Egypt. The fertile valley of the Nile, so rich in resources, yet long oppressed by Byzantine misrule, welcomed the Arabs more readily than its imperial masters supposed. Amr ibn al-As led a small but determined army through the desert, capturing fortress after fortress. The great city of Alexandria, with its libraries, scholars, and maritime wealth, resisted with tenacity, but eventually capitulated. Egypt, which had supplied Rome with grain for centuries, now became one of the principal pillars of the caliphate. The Arabs built a new city, Fustat, as the center of their administration, and their rule proved more efficient and less burdensome than the Byzantine taxation system it replaced. From Egypt, the conquest of Africa followed. The region's patchwork of Romanized towns, Berber tribes, and half-independent rulers created both obstacles and opportunities. Carthage, still formidable after centuries of decline, was taken, briefly lost, and then retaken by the Arabs, who destroyed its fortifications so thoroughly that its ancient grandeur vanished into memory. The Arab armies pushed westward along the coast, overcoming the resistance of the Berbers, who were at times fierce opponents and at other times eager allies. The conquest of the northern coast of Africa prepared the way for one of the most dramatic operations in the Arab expansion, the invasion of Spain. Spain, ruled by the Visigoths, had been weakened by civil war, famine, and the indolence of its kings. When the Berber general Tariq crossed the narrow strait that now bears his name, he found a kingdom divided and unable to resist his advance. At the Battle of Guadalete, the Gothic army was shattered, the king vanished, and the remnants of the nobility retreated in confusion. City after city surrendered. Toledo, the capital, opened its gates. Within a few years, almost the entire peninsula had submitted, though the brave mountaineers of the Asturian highlands preserved the spark of resistance that would ignite the later Reconquista. The caliphate, however, did not merely expand through force of arms. It absorbed, tolerated, and even revived the cultures of the conquered lands. Scholars, administrators, and merchants flourished under its authority. Yet the historian cannot overlook the extraordinary swiftness with which vast territories were subdued. Within a century after Muhammad's flight from Mecca, the rule of his successors extended from the Indus to the Atlantic, from the mountains of Armenia to the sands of the Sahara. It was a transformation unparalleled in human history, and its effects would endure for more than a millennium. Thus, Chapter 51 portrays a movement propelled by faith, ambition, and the energy of a people newly united under a powerful creed. Though the Arabs were aided by the weakness of their enemies, their victories arose from their own courage, discipline, and the conviction that they fought not for plunder alone, but for the triumph of a divine message. Their conquests reshaped the map of the Old World and set in motion the cultural and religious currents that still influence the modern age. Chapter 52. More Conquests by the Arabs. The astonishing expansion of the Arab dominion, which had already carried the warriors of Islam from the banks of the Indus to the Atlantic, continued with a momentum that defied the natural limits of empire. In this chapter, the historian surveys the further conquests of the Arabs, victories that pushed their frontiers deeper into Central Asia, across the deserts of Africa, and into the waters of the Mediterranean. Yet within these triumphs lay the first tremors of the forces that would eventually weaken and divide their vast imperial structure. The early success of the Arabs rested upon a potent mixture of religious fervor, military austerity, and political simplicity. The caliphate, while still united, acted with a single will, and its armies, though modest in number, displayed a discipline born of hardship and a cohesion forged by faith. But as the chapter reveals, the next stages of expansion introduced new forms of warfare, new enemies, and new political pressures that would strain the unity of the empire. To the east, the Arabs moved beyond Persia into the regions of Transoxiana, the lands of Samarkand, Bukhara, and the steppes where Turkic horsemen roamed. Here, the lieutenants of the caliphs waged campaigns that were as much diplomatic as military. They confronted fortified cities and mobile tribes, climates of harsh winters and scorching summers, and enemies whose tactics resembled their own. The conquests in these remote territories were long and difficult. Yet through persistence, alliances, and the resolve of their commanders, the Arabs secured a loose authority over these distant provinces, though the submission of the region was more nominal than real. Distance, climate, and culture all conspired to loosen the bonds of allegiance. Many governors soon exercised the powers of kings under the thin veil of loyalty to Baghdad or Damascus. At the same time, the Arabs pressed forward in Africa. Their progress across the northern coast was marked by repeated clashes with the Berber tribes, whose valor and volatility made them both dangerous opponents and valuable allies. Though the Arabs conquered Carthage and pushed steadily westward, their hold on the region was repeatedly shaken by native uprisings. Still, the establishment of new cities and garrisons laid the groundwork for Islamic civilization to take root in these lands. From these African provinces, future generations of Berbers would carry the banner of Islam across the strait that separated Africa from Europe. This momentum westward culminated in the invasion of Spain, a frontier where the Arab and Berber forces, united in purpose, found the Visigothic kingdom fractured by civil war. Their victory on the field of Guadalete opened the peninsula almost at once. Toledo, Córdoba, and Seville fell with startling rapidity, and within a few years, the Arabs ruled nearly all of Spain. Yet the narrative also notes that the Pyrenees proved a more durable barrier than the deserts of Egypt or the plains of Persia. The Franks halted the Arab advance in Gaul, and from that moment, the western limit of the caliphate was fixed. While the Arabs extended their dominion by land, their power at sea also grew. They built fleets capable of challenging the Byzantine Empire in the Mediterranean. Their boldest attempt was the siege of Constantinople itself, a monumental endeavor that pitted the endurance of Arab arms against the formidable defenses of the imperial capital. The legendary Greek fire, wielded by the Byzantines, turned back the Arab assault with a fury that astonished even battle-hardened veterans. The failure to take Constantinople marked the first major check to Arab expansion and revealed that their empire, though vast, was not invincible. In the midst of these campaigns, the internal structure of the caliphate underwent profound changes. The Umayyad dynasty, which had governed with relative cohesion from Damascus, was overthrown by the Abbasids, whose capital at Baghdad shifted the center of the empire eastward. Under the Abbasids, the empire displayed great splendor, intellectual vitality, and economic prosperity, yet its political unity weakened. The caliphs, though still revered, no longer exercised direct command over their distant provinces. Governors appointed to the edges of the empire gradually transformed their offices into hereditary principalities. Spain broke away entirely, becoming an independent Umayyad emirate. North Africa fell under the control of the Aghlabids, who ruled in their own right while acknowledging the caliph only in ceremonial prayers. In Persia, the Tahirites established a dynasty that, though respectful of the caliphal name, governed with complete autonomy. These were not yet revolts, but the natural expression of an empire too large to be governed from a single center. The most dramatic threat to the unity of Islam arose from the Qarmasians, a fanatical sect whose doctrines and ambitions challenged both the spiritual and temporal authority of the caliphs. Their raids harassed pilgrim routes, destabilized provinces, and even struck at the heart of the faith by desecrating its sacred institutions. Their rise revealed the political fragility hidden beneath the outward splendor of the Abbasid court. The chapter also recounts the temporary revival of Byzantine power under the Emperor John Zimisces. His sudden and brilliant campaigns carried him deep into territories long held by the Arabs. Ancient cities, Emesa, Apamea, and Damascus, briefly returned to imperial hands, their walls echoing once more with Greek commands after centuries of Arabic rule. The emperor even advanced beyond the Euphrates, a feat unachieved since Rome's distant triumphs. But these victories were ephemeral. The vastness of the Arab lands, the hardships of climate, and the logistical strain of maintaining distant armies compelled the Byzantines to withdraw. Their conquests faded almost as quickly as they arose. In its final reflections, the chapter examines the causes behind the gradual weakening of the caliphate. It was not defeat in battle, but the inevitable consequences of size and diversity that eroded its authority. The very success of the Arabs generated the conditions of their decline. New cultures, climates, and political traditions entered the empire. New dynasties emerged, new identities formed. Allegiance to the caliph became symbolic rather than substantial. What had begun as a unified theocratic state evolved into a constellation of kingdoms bound by a shared faith but divided in their ambitions. Thus, Chapter 52 presents both the grandeur and the irony of Arab history. The same energy that carried their armies across 3 continents produced an empire too large for any one ruler to govern. Their conquests reshaped the world, but the magnitude of their victories contained the seeds of fragmentation. Yet, even in decline, the intellectual, cultural, and religious influence of the early caliphate endured, leaving an imprint upon Asia, Africa, and Europe that time has never erased. Chapter 53: The Fate of the Eastern Empire. In tracing the long destiny of the Eastern Empire, from the age of Heraclius to the dawn of the Crusades, one observes not a simple tale of steady decay, but a complex alternation of revival and relapse, of sudden vigor followed by languor, of splendor masking fragility. This chapter surveys 6 centuries during which the Empire of Constantinople, though assailed by enemies and eroded from within, nevertheless endured with a tenacity that astonishes even the historian who records its decline. It survived not by the strength of its arms alone, but by the subtlety of its diplomacy, the resilience of its institutions, and the wealth concentrated in its radiant capital. The chapter begins with the transformation of the imperial government following the loss of Syria, Egypt, and much of Persia to the Arabs. The empire, contracting to a more defensible core, reorganized itself into military provinces known as themes. These districts, governed by generals who wielded both civil and military authority, created a decentralized structure that allowed the empire to resist the torrent of Arab invasions. Over time, however, what was born from emergency calcified into an unwieldy bureaucracy. Court titles multiplied, ceremonial grew ever more elaborate, and the imperial palace became a labyrinth of protocol where etiquette mattered more than statesmanship. The ceremonial excesses of Byzantium were not mere ornaments, they were instruments of authority. The emperor's majesty, expressed through jeweled robes, solemn processions, and thrones that moved by hidden machinery, was intended to awe subjects and visitors alike. But the grandeur concealed a fatal dependence on form over substance. Generals who should have been hardened in campaigns were instead schooled in the choreography of courtly prostration. The military spirit of Rome, once the pride of the empire, waned under the weight of ritualized servility. Yet the empire was not devoid of strength. Its capital, Constantinople, enjoyed a position unrivaled in the world. Fed by the riches of East and West, guarded by walls that had defied countless sieges, the city was a marvel of urban vitality. The revenues of the empire poured into its treasuries. Some emperors, notorious for their avarice, accumulated hoards of gold so immense that they exceeded the needs of war and peace alike. Others spent lavishly on churches, palaces, and diplomatic gifts designed to bend foreign princes to their will. Wealth, however, could not compensate for fragile institutions. It bought time, not stability. The chapter then turns to the military system of Byzantium. The early theme armies, composed of free soldiers settled on military lands, furnished the empire with a dependable force. But as centuries passed, the system decayed. Land accumulated in the hands of magnates, peasant soldiers lost their holdings, and the empire increasingly relied on mercenaries, Varangians, Turks, Franks, whose loyalty depended on pay rather than patriotism. The once superb navy, which had preserved the empire by repelling Arab fleets with the terrifying Greek fire, was neglected. As naval discipline collapsed, the seas fell under foreign control. Against this backdrop of internal change arose the Macedonian dynasty, whose long succession brought the empire its final classical revival. Under Basil I, Leo VI, Constantine VII, and Basil II, the empire recovered strength and territory. Crete and Cyprus were reclaimed, the Bulgarians were subdued after decades of relentless warfare, and Armenia, long a contested frontier, was brought under imperial dominion. It was an era marked by scholarship as well as conquest. Learned emperors compiled encyclopedic works, systematized law, and patronized arts and letters with a devotion surpassing that of any medieval court. Yet, even at its zenith, Macedonian Byzantium bore the seeds of its future decline. The aristocracy grew in wealth and influence, the free military peasantry dwindled, and the administrative machine, refined by generations of clerks and scholars, became too intricate for efficient government. The empire's political culture, skeptical of innovation and proud of its antiquity, began to turn inward. While Western Europe evolved feudal institutions and military practices suited to its age, Byzantium preserved ancient forms that, although elegant, proved ill-fitted to the changing world. The narrative then advances to the age of the Comneni, when new enemies emerged. From the west came the Normans, restless, ambitious, superbly armored soldiers who wrested southern Italy from Byzantium control and repeatedly threatened the empire. From the north, Pechenegs and other steppe peoples struck across the Danube. But far more menacing were the Seljuk Turks, hardened by desert life and warlike zeal. Their victory over the imperial forces at Manzikert shocked the empire to its core. Anatolia, the heartland of Byzantium manpower and revenue, was lost almost in a single campaign. The Turks advanced with astonishing speed, establishing the Sultanate of Rum and reducing Constantinople's territories to a shadow of their former expanse. This disaster did not arise solely from military misfortune. The internal politics of Byzantium had eroded the discipline of the army, filled its ranks with unreliable mercenaries, and burdened the generals with intrigue and factional jealousy. The empire's emperors, more skilled in palace maneuvering than in war, frequently undermined their own commanders, fearful that a victorious general might become a rival for the throne. Thus, the empire became vulnerable not because it lacked brave soldiers, but because its political structure devoured the very men it needed most. A further theme of the chapter is the widening estrangement between Constantinople and the Latin West. Though they shared a common religion in theory, their divergence in ritual, language, and culture grew inexorably. The Byzantiums regarded Western knights as crude barbarians. The Latins viewed the Greeks as effeminate, subtle, and untrustworthy. Mutual suspicion hardened into hostility. When the empire, weakened after Manzikert, appealed to the West for aid, the response came in a form neither side fully anticipated: the First Crusade. The Crusaders, driven by religious zeal and feudal ambition, marched through the empire as uneasy allies. Their presence revealed the full extent of the East-West divide. Byzantium diplomacy attempted to bind them by oaths. Latin impatience and pride resisted such constraints. Though the crusade restored some Byzantium territories, it also planted the seeds of future catastrophe. The empire's mistrust of the West and the West's contempt for Byzantium would culminate, a century later, in the sack of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade, an event foreshadowed ominously in the closing pages of this chapter. In its conclusion, the chapter reflects on the paradox of the Eastern Empire, a state simultaneously strong and fragile, enduring yet ever threatened, luxurious yet undermined by its own refinement. Byzantium survived centuries of assault through resilience, wealth, and diplomacy, but its institutions, steeped in ceremony, guarded by eunuchs, and weakened by faction, could not adapt indefinitely. The empire lingered not because it was vigorous, but because its enemies often lacked unity. When a true storm arose, Byzantium had no shelter but its walls, and no salvation but luck. Thus, the fate of the Eastern Empire, as traced in this chapter, is not the sudden collapse of a mighty state, but the long, intricate fading of a civilization too proud of its past to fully confront its future. It endured triumphs, reversals, revivals, and humiliations, moving steadily toward the moment when the world would witness with both sorrow and awe the passing of Rome's last and most enduring heir.